Hi, I'm Valerie Williams-Sanchez. I'm a 2021 graduate of the literacy program at St. John's University. My interests, both academically and in terms of research, center on culturally relevant pedagogy and multimodal text, specifically children's picture books. I am a children's book author, and this is the heart of my practice and therefore the heart of my research. I very much thank you for inviting me to participate in the Leadership Symposium, and we'll look forward to sharing my work with you in a bit. Thank you. Hello, my name is Valerie Williams-Sanchez, and it's my pleasure today to share with you my dissertation research, Reading Builds Empathy, Piloting a Literacy Tool to Measure Reading's Impact on Kids' Empathy Development. Acknowledgements. I would first like to thank my family and friends for their unwavering support. Also, I offer thanks to Dr. Evan Ortlieb and Dr. Barbara Marignac, who encouraged me through the program and to pursue my vision. Also, my very special thanks to Dr. Joe Rumenap, who worked miracles from Chicago to help me cross the finish line. And last and not least, no words can express my gratitude to my dissertation committee for what each of them have done for me. I can only hope to pay it forward through my future work. Drs. Blake and Cook, I sincerely, very sincerely thank you. Positionality. In my practice as a children's book author, teacher, and researcher, empathic understanding has been the cornerstone. This has also been true with the therapeutic communities and special needs learning populations with which I've worked. The ability to be seen, heard, and understood matters, and no more so than for the early reader. This is why my literacy research, advocacy, and practice of creating children's picture books seeks to better understand and utilize this important genre to enhance literacy development. These are the critical dimensions of my practice, those which motivate my pursuit of this degree, my study, and my present research. My order of presentation for today will follow introduction, purpose of the study, methods, results, discussion, and conclusion. Introduction. Empathy. Empathy is a complex construct that is the lifeblood of a civil society and central to literacy development. It's a multifaceted construct developed early on that expands as we grow. Empathy is nurtured through our implicit and explicit socio-cognitive exchanges and experiences, according to Vygotsky, 1979. Facets of this construct that are of interest to this study are three: affective empathy, cognitive empathy, and ethnocultural empathy. Empathy is also central to Ladson Billings' culturally relevant pedagogy, a learning philosophy rooted in Ferrer's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Empathy can also be identified in Common Core education and CASEL, social emotional learning standards, both of which are frameworks that are eclipsing existing pedagogies in America's schools. Culturally relevant or diversity text and books are among the tools used in this pedagogy. In order to effectively define and measure the efficacy of such tools across SEL areas, include empathy and its many dimensions. It is also important to have the ability to optimize, replicate, monitor, and control these tools' utilizations. And for this reason, the present study, the Reading Builds Empathy Literacy Study, seeks to pilot an instrument that can measure early readers' empathy growth. The case for early empathy development. Children's ideas of self begin to form during the sensitive periods in early brain development through age 4. By age 5, kids become more independent. They're eager to understand their world and the environments in which they live. Their internal landscape is actively being shaped by their imaginations and interactions. That's why picture books are so important. Picture books show children that they are seen and valued. When all aspects of the child, including attributes related to race and culture, are reflected in the books and media that the children see, it's a critical step towards helping them feel welcome and connected to their world, teachers, and peers. This feeling of trust is crucial because it sets the stage to engage freely in the exploration of learning. Empathy and teaching standards, Common Core and beyond. Schools and literacy organizations are increasingly using picture books to build readers' empathy, a core facet of Common Core and socio-emotional learning objectives. In Common Core standards, you see empathy reflected in the reading, writing instruction, speaking, and listening processes that are among the standards for students in age 2. The ability to acknowledge differences in points of view of characters, including speaking in a different voice for each character when reading dialogue aloud, is a critical distinction and a critical skill that's expected and anticipated for children in this grade group. Writing instruction also echoes the impacts of empathy, in as much as children are asked to write opinion pieces in which they introduce the topic of a book that they are writing about, state an opinion, supply reasons that support the opinion, and use linking words to connect opinion and reasons and provide concluding statements or sections. Speaking and listening processes determined by Common Core that also include empathy build on others' talk and conversations by linking their comments to the remarks of others. Empathy and teaching standards is not just limited to academics. CASEL, or the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, has 5 competency areas, of which empathy is squarely rooted in the social awareness category. These skills, are those that the preschool through high school student is expected to have a competency in and should be able to demonstrate in order to show academic success, school and civic engagement, health and wellness, and fulfillment in their careers, or at least fulfilling careers. Social awareness in particular articulates and explicitly calls out empathy as one of the attributes students should be able to master. Specifically, students should have the abilities to used to understand the perspectives and empathize with others from diverse backgrounds, cultures, and contexts. And here you note the notion of empathizing with cultures, those from different cultures, brings into our focus and our purview the notion of ethnocultural empathy. They should also have capacity to feel compassion for others and understand broad historical and social norms for behavior in distinct settings. Specifically, the social awareness attribute calls out demonstrating empathy and compassion as a skill each child needs to survive, or to succeed and achieve, not just in school, but beyond. For this reason, it's one of interest in this study. Further, grounding this study in its theoretical framework, the culturally relevant pedagogy is a group of theories grounded and informed by Vygotsky's sociocultural theory, while Ferrer's praxis and theory, as explained in his Pedagogy of the Oppressed, argue against banking models of education. So again, refining this conversation tonight down to its very essence, I would just quickly point out that among the posits that Vygotsky put forth include learning surfaces in 2 stages. Specifically, there's the interpsychological development and the intrapsychological development that is most critical for children. And the interpsychological means there is growth between individuals, while the intrapsychological is the growth that happens within the child's own mind. Culturally relevant teaching in the brain is the most recent iteration of culturally relevant pedagogy, and it is also the theoretical framework that is most relevant to my work. Culturally responsive teaching in the brain actually looks at the convergence of CRP and newly emerged cognitive science. According to Zurita Hammond, the author of the culturally responsive teaching in the brain, this approach, or this philosophy, looks at culture as a trust builder and a cognitive scaffold to build on the unique gifts and talents of every student. It does this by focusing on improving the learning capacity of diverse learners, centering around the cognitive aspects of teaching and learning, and the effective socio-emotional aspects that facilitate cognitive development. Concerning itself with building cognitive and social-emotional learning capacity in diverse students of color, give them the academic mindset to push back or at least to challenge the dominant narratives about people of color, as well as the dominant culture, which historically has sought out those banking forms and formats of learning in which information is simply given to the student, as opposed to creating students who are critical thinkers, who look at the education and the content of what they've been asked to master with a critical lens. Building brain power by increasing capacity in order to improve information processing skills is another of the attributes of Hammond's CRT and B. Against this background and with these concepts in play, the Reading Builds Empathy Literacy study was developed. The overarching goal behind my research was to develop an interventional study that was able to effectively measure early readers' empathy learning as derived from picture books reading. Now, in order to do this, though, and first and foremost, the present instrument has been created and piloted in order to determine its ability to effectively quantify the child's empathy development in terms of the interpsychological development between people and the intrapsychological development within the child that I mentioned before, as discussed by Vygotsky in 1970. This is looked at through the relationship to the parent's assessment of their child's reading behaviors as it relates to affective, cognitive, and ethnocultural empathy in my study, with the child self-reports for the same construct dimensions. Simply put, the purpose of this goal, the goal of this study is to develop this type of instrument, because to my knowledge, nothing like it exists for the age group. That is, a quantitative measure for children ages 6 through 8 that measures affective, cognitive, and ethnocultural facets of empathy. Further, a tool of this type would yield data to help educators better determine best practices for early readers' use and implementation of culturally relevant literature and pedagogy. The same information could shape and inform at-home literacy practices, readers' content choices, and reading behaviors. For this reason, the results in statistical data and analysis of this quantitative look were intended to provide information to assess the reliability and validity of the instrument as an effective measure of this construct. Such findings will have important implications for literacy development, including reading, writing, and lifelong learning, as well as curriculum development. The RBE, as I call the Reading Builds Empathy study, hypothesizes a positive correlation between parents' reports and children's reports of empathy. Further, it is hypothesized that on measures of reading behaviors like time spent reading, or the number of books in the home, and overall frequency of reading with others, that respondents who score higher on these questions would also have higher empathy scores across the 3 subscales. So given this understanding and this kind of perspective, the hypothesis of the study is, or the hypothesis that I seek to test, is whether or not there is a positive correlation between parents' reports and children's self-reports on levels of empathy along the subscales of those 3 dimensions of empathy. My null hypothesis in this case, therefore, would be that parents and children's self-reports on empathy and its construct subscales are not correlated, that there is no relationship. To question or to test these hypotheses, I developed 3 research questions. My first is that the RBE survey is an effective instrument to measure affective, cognitive, and ethnocultural empathy for readers in my target group. To do this, I developed the survey protocols, 2 surveys which were successfully completed, and as well as field notes that capture the feedback and moments of genuine connection, something that turned out to be the unexpected hero in my study. For my second research question, I asked, how correlated are parents' reports of their child's empathy and their child's self-reported perceptions of their child's empathy? So for that, I chose to pursue a Pearson's correlation statistical analysis to determine the relationships between the parents and the children's reports on those subscales and on total scores. This is how I would demonstrate, or at least surface, whether or not there was a true relationship of significance between the 2 sets of scores or the 2 sets of data. For my third research question, I posed, how do at-home reading practices relate to affective, cognitive, and ethnocultural empathy? In order to test this question, I applied a Cronbach's, or I conducted a Cronbach's alpha to measure how closely related a set of items are as a group to establish the scale, reliability, and internal consistency of the data collected. With my three research questions articulated, I moved into my study design. For my methods, and to test these ideas, the RBE study used, as mentioned previously, 2 survey instruments which sought to capture the responses of parents and children through independent and mediated self-reports on the following dimensions. In the first survey, the parents say, parents' self-reported responses were on 41 items. And as you can see here on this figure, that the dimensions included demographics, reading behaviors, and empathy. For the Kids Say child's self-report survey, I had 23 items which sought to test or to gather information from children regarding their thoughts and perceptions of affective ethnocultural empathy, cognitive empathy, and cognitive ethnocultural empathy. For the empathy-related questions, my instruments were derived from the scale of ethnocultural empathy, that Wang et al. 2003. And for my kids, the empathic questions related to affective ethnocultural and cognitive ethnocultural also came from the scale of ethnocultural empathy. The cognitive empathy questions, of which there were 12, were derived from the interpersonal reactivity index from Davis. All three, well, the two model or the 2 source instruments, the Wang and Davis, each showed high levels of reliability. And that's why I used them, because I needed a strong set of questions that could be implemented in my study. Interestingly and worth note, each of those instruments are aimed and geared for children aged much higher, much older than my target area. And because of that development that I alluded to early in my introduction, my interest was really to find out if I could get the same information from a younger set of children before ideas and attitudes had formed, but rather in the more developmental stages where there was opportunity to affect change. To conduct my study, I set my inclusion criteria as any consenting young reader and parent or caregiver pair with an interest and an internet access, I recruited from communities in the Ramapo Catskills library system. So my study was grounded in the library community. First, I reached out to the 187,860 cardholders through the Rockland County Libraries, or 6 branches, and the Nyack Basics organization that's located in Rockland. I also sent out recruitment flyers and recruitment information to diversity reading organizations like the Multicultural Children's Book Day and the We Need Diverse Books organization. Parents in California, Delaware, and Texas, as a result of associations and colleagues that I have in those areas who are parents of children and teachers of children in that age group, were also recruited. And finally, churches in my local area all were sent recruitment materials in order to fill out, as to find as many participants as possible. Now, this was the plan. Then came COVID-19. And as a result, my RBE became a pandemic situated study. That was as a result of the coronavirus lockdown protocols that were put into place in the state and the nation. What this meant was that the social distancing, the prohibition of public assembly and large-scale co-location activities, and the required use of PPE meant that my study had to pivot from one that was rooted in interpersonal interactions through the Me and My Reading Profile framework into a study that was a fully digital research study. Now, you can imagine, as you know, that interpersonal exchanges are very different in the digital space as they, rather than in the personal space. So this shift was a significant hurdle and distinction and challenge that I had to meet. Nevertheless, I persevered and was able to develop an RBE process that was completely digital. Here is the process map for my study. My first step included the enrollment and consent of any recruited participant. Recruits were asked to review the recruitment flyer, to sign up by completing the questionnaire and consent form. That was all online. It was a digital form. Next, once this questionnaire was signed off and they had consented, both for the parent and the child, participants received a welcome letter with details about the study. And they received a study ID, which was meant to protect their anonymity. Third, the parents were asked to complete their Parent Say survey by logging in to take the 20-minute self-report survey. At the conclusion of their survey, they were also asked to schedule their children for their Kids Say survey appointment. At the time of the scheduled appointment, in step 4, kids logged in at their scheduled time to complete the Kids Say. It was a proctored survey that lasted about 15 minutes, and I was the administrator for that portion of the testing, or that portion of the survey. At the conclusion of step 4, participants had completed the battery of surveys for this research. I confirmed surveys were completed and sent each dyad a thank you package for completing the study participation. Here's some of the assets used in this process. To the left, you'll see the recruitment flyer. It was also the artwork that I used for my website homepage. I developed a study web page where participants and prospects could not only find information, but also click to enroll in the study, as well as find any information that was relevant to their participation, as you see in the study group's information landing page. It's the second image here on the screen. The last screen is the last page of my website, which was the researcher information, in which I gave biographical information about myself as a principal investigator, included citations of past academic writing, as well as contact information for the school and the IRB. Next, we have the engagement and instrumentation, all of which was administered through Qualtrics, which is an online survey software and platform. First, to the left, study enrollment was handled through a cover page in which folks entered all their contact information. This process concluded with them reading and signing a consent form. Unless they signed in, gave me the signature of their consent, they would not move forward. But once they signed it, they would, as mentioned previously, go ahead and take their Parent Say survey, which is featured here in the middle panel. This is the first of the several screens that parents were able to read the questions and give their answers. And the first question, of course, is to enter their ID number. So I would know whose responses were to go with which child's responses. The Kids Say survey, the homepage is shown here to the far right, began with the child assent, in which I read to the children before engaging in the survey that, this was something that they were doing of their own volition and that they were not required, etc. None of the children, all of the children decided to go forward with the study. And upon their completion, these are the items that they received as a thank you. To the far left, there's a thank you letter from me, the principal investigator on St. John letterhead. They then received a certificate of participation that was made out to them and their survey study team. And they also received a free ebook, one of the books that I mentioned in my children's book collection. In this case, they each received a copy of Eddie and the Hot Cocoa Hot Rod. The results and outcomes of my study were interesting, to say the least. And among the responses, and probably what was most interesting, were the demographics of my study. I found that the majority of my participants obviously were from New York. That was no surprise. 15 participants of my total 21 moms were from New York, and that equated to 75% of my study participants. Of that number, 11 were between the ages of 40 and 50, and that was equal to 52.4% of my total survey population that were in that age group. Most all were very highly educated, with the majority, with the number 9 and 42.9% having master's level education. As far as occupations were concerned, most were professionals, of which that totaled 10. However, there were a few homemakers and even some tradespeople included in my survey. But by and large, the 47.6 was the highest number. Yeah, and I think that actually aligns with the trade call out, because the majority were teachers and professionals of that nature. The household income of my families, surprisingly, skewed to the higher end, with $100,000 or more as the annual household income. And that was the case for 12 of my participants, which was roughly equivalent to 57, a little over half, 57.1%. As for the children, the majority were 7-year-olds at 33.3%. The majority, if not all, well, actually the majority, 15 out of my 21 children were white, again at 71.4%. The split on gender was half and half. I had 9 boys and 9 girls, and 3 who chose not to respond. And the majority of my kids were public schooled. I had 1 who was homeschooled and 2 who were private schooled. By and large, second graders outnumbered any of the other grades at 42.9%. So with those demographics and the data that I gleaned from my 2 surveys, I was able to do my statistical analysis as called out and mentioned earlier to get responses and answers for my 3 research questions. My first question is the RBE survey an effective instrument to measure effective cognitive, ethnocultural and effective cognitive and ethnocultural empathy for early readers? The answer was that the 2 surveys were successfully completed and field notes captured feedback. The evaluation of the RBE survey instruments and protocols, while yielded mixed results that are going to be further explored in my discussion, as well as statistical analysis, which yielded mixed results. The real answer to this is yes, I was able to successfully complete the battery of tests, and it proved to be a significant or a successful effective instrument for these, to capture the data to get these measurements. For my question 2, how correlated are parents' reports of children's empathy and children's reported perceptions of child's empathy? This, I got a different answer. I actually ended up getting a null hypothesis, meaning that the parents' and kids' self-reports on empathy and the construct subscales were not correlated based on the Pearson's correlation coefficient, which came in at negative 0.17. That suggests that there was really no relationship between the parents' responses and the kids' responses. However, because I got negative values, I think more work is needed in terms of better articulating my empathy subscales and the questions that are posed to my children respondents. My data for parents was pretty strong, but it was the data for the kids that did not, show the cohesive pattern that I had anticipated. And here you see this in question 3. How do at-home reading practices relate to effective cognitive and ethnocultural empathy? Interestingly, on all of the psychometric property subscales, I had strong responses in the parent say categories. You'll see at the far right under Cronbach's alpha, my behaviors had a 0.75, which is very strong in terms of levels of high internal reliability on the 15 items, all combined. For parents on kids' empathy, parents' reports on kids' empathy also had a relatively high reliability, internal reliability, with a score of 0.68. That was on the 12 items. And again, aggregated as shown, those items showed, again, a high level of internal reliability. The kids say along those same subscales and broken out and in the aggregate, none of them really showed a strong correlation. The strongest were the responses for ethnocultural empathy, but that showed a very low value of 0.44. So those are my statistical analysis results. However, the statistical analysis was only part of the process and only part of what the study entailed. So in terms of study achievements, while my statistical analyses yielded a null hypothesis by and large, the study did have some successes and achievements. As a situated study in a pandemic milieu, the fact that the study was completed was among the biggest achievements. Because during the 3 months of the study's recruitment, more than 1,300 residents of New York State alone lost their lives due to the coronavirus. So at the time when I was trying to get people to participate in my study, the state was going through basically one of the most tragic and severe, pandemics in history. So the fact that the COVID-19 pandemic, which originated in Wuhan, China, was in play, was something that was really kind of, a huge hurdle to overcome. But nonetheless, we persevered and got through the study. To complete the study, processes were developed. And again, as I mentioned, the processes that were originally meant to be in person were moved to a digital format, and the RBE study drew on new technology and engaged audiences with resources that relied solely on digital and social media. To do this, the digital survey administration in configuring the new process had to take these nine factors into consideration: ease of administration, length of time, ability to create clear directions, fit for office, ease in scoring, ease of interpretation, cost, validity, and reliability. For recruitment, also, I know that the process worked because while we had very few who followed the full protocol and the full battery of survey tests, there were more than 450 original hits to the study website. So while not many ultimately signed up, the site and the study was very visible, and people in the communities where it was being promoted were actually hearing and having an interest in the study. But all told, the total participants was very small sample size of 18, which was once the 3 sets of missing data were kicked out from that original 21. So therefore, the data that was derived was not sufficient or robust enough to make inferences about the population at large. And again, as shown, the demographics were pretty flat and didn't really demonstrate the diversity I would have liked to have seen. Moreover, and what was probably the most problematic, was the construct muddiness. The statistical analysis revealed that the construct was not panning out as clearly, and the subscales that were shown were neither stable or reliable, which was a problem. But thinking about that and doing a bit more investigation and consideration, the recommendation is that the construct dimension should be further articulated and refined, or that the 3 categories should be tested or surveyed one at a time instead of in one battery, or instead of in one survey. The MMRP, the mean my reading profile construct, was motivation, and this was the framework that was kind of implemented or replicated, or there was the MMRP was the motivation for the framework. But the MMRP used motivation as its attribute and used it as its construct. And motivation, it's very complex, very much like empathy, but it doesn't necessarily have the same dimensions. And so to kind of pull the learning attributes, specifically the intrinsic or extrinsic motivation as tested through the MMRP, It's not the same as the study that I sought to do for empathy. And this calls into question the limitation of the empathy construct in this application. Empathy could still probably be used in this way, but it would have to be kind of conceptualized in a different way. So there is that aspect of its muddiness. Further, the construct could simply be muddy because of the kids in my target age. As I mentioned, this is part of the novelty and the innovation in this study is that it was looking at an age group that really hasn't been tested in this way. The kids of this age, this young age, have not necessarily been tested on their or surveyed on their notion of a construct in a self-reported document. So in those ways, it was very novel. And I know that this is something that hasn't happened, obviously, because of my research, but I do know that it is ultimately something that kids in the next developmental stage are able to actually self-report on, because that's demonstrated in the 1988 work of Asakawa, etc., or et al. These researchers were able to derive such information from children in ages that are slightly older. My instruments also had some interesting results in my post-research analysis. There were moments of genuine connection that were yielded from implementing the instruments and administering the surveys that really provided some really insightful information. A couple of bullet points just to share was that the process of teaching kids about reading research was my intro and my way of grounding the work and engaging the kids. I explained to them what reading research was, asked them if they'd ever done reading research, and basically engaged them briefly before we got involved in our survey. I was meant to provide, some comfort, put the respondents at ease, and to develop some semblance of trust before getting into the battery of questions. My homeschool mom's feedback on the SEL coursework that she had done with her child proved that she was surprised that her child had forgotten that the whole concept of empathy seemed to be a new one to her child during the study. And this was something the mom was pretty interested, fascinated, and ultimately kind of frustrated by. But to me, it was a really important bit of information because it suggested that this child who had just spent a week learning about SEL coursework and empathy in particular still did not make the connection in terms of the concepts and the conceptual questions that were being asked. It's that response that led me to think that perhaps this age group is still a bit too young to be surveyed on the affective measure of empathy. However, again, me and my reading profile was able to do it with motivation. So I want to kind of continue to work my construct. The kids for whom the RBE, there was a child for whom the RBE was his third time to participate in a research study. So that with a bunch of kids of masters or highly educated moms who were very conscientious about their children's education, it came as a bit of a surprise, but I guess ultimately not as a surprise that there were children who had participated in research prior. My survey interface, my kids suggested, or rather my parents suggested, that I implement a more dynamic screen experience, and something perhaps more immersive. I think, this is the age of video games and whatnot, and my flat screen of text and answer choices was a bit too, what's the word I'm looking for? Not stoic, but a bit too Spartan, that's it, to hold the kids' interests. And some also asked that perhaps contextualizing content, like reading a story before asking the questions, would have made understanding the questions a bit easier for the kids. However, it's the lexile versus conceptual complexity that I'm convinced was part of the problem, or part of the issue. My survey items were adapted to meet lexile differences. So in the original data I took, I translated it for the lexile, but I didn't translate it for the concept. So meaning, I changed the words so that they were words that the children could understand. But even though they understood the words, they didn't necessarily understand the idea, the concept of empathy. And that's something that I need to test further as I go forward. Finally, another interesting quirk was that my parents asked about the emojis and why did I use junk food emojis, as you see at the top of the screen, instead of healthy food items. And the emojis were used as sequencing icons or sequencing imagery, right? Instead of the ordinal numbers where kids would be counting and wanting to know, are we done yet? I used the sequencing icons so that they would know that they were moving through different questions, but not giving them a sense of where they were in the total battery of survey questions. So in conclusion, the Reading Builds Empathy Study 2.0 is what I hope will be the next round of the Reading Builds Empathy Study. Either during the pandemic or once COVID-19 is no longer a factor, I think this study would, still has value. This is because empathy is has increasingly become a construct of interest. And I think as more and more parents and children have used picture books for SEL learning, and with it being a requisite skill that kids need to learn, I feel it's really important that we know that the books that we're using to teach these attributes are actually working. All told, and once perfected, a tool of this sort can, as originally managed or imagined, provide useful to educators and parents in their efforts to build their child's intellective capacity. They can do this by supporting their child's socio-emotional and literacy development through wide reading, nurturing the empathetic individuals who are critical thinkers, helping them to better understand themselves and those around them, as well as providing a formative assessment designed to provide families feedback to increase and expand students' ability to engage in deeper, more complex learning. The RBE also ultimately could help the child learn to appreciate the diverse feelings, thoughts, and ethnocultural experiences of those they know and have yet to encounter in the world. This is the aim of the Reading Builds Empathy study, and what I hope to achieve in further iterations of this research. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation. I appreciate any feedback that you might be able to provide. And I think, again, and probably most auspiciously, I guess is a word I could use in this instance, I thank St. John's University for all of the leadership, the academic guidance, and support and nurturing that they've provided me as an emerging researcher and young, relatively young academic. Thank you very much. Good night.